In the icy wilderness of Antarctica, there was a peculiar rock. Amidst the vast, smooth, and snowy landscape, it stood alone like a dark smudge. This rock had been there for ages, untouched except for occasional snowfall. Roberta Score, a lab manager at NASA's Johnson Space Center, had spent countless hours in Antarctica searching for rocks just like this one. Antarctica was an unexpected treasure trove for these discoveries. These rocks were easy to spot against the blindingly white ice. Why was it so important? Because it wasn't just any rock. It was a meteorite that had fallen from space thousands of years ago. Roberta's rock, known as ALH 84001, was initially unimpressive. However, it turned out to be extraordinary. It was a piece of Mars. The rock's chemical composition perfectly matched the surface of the red planet. Turns out, it had been blasted off Mars during a colossal collision millions of years ago. It was wandering through space before landing on Earth. There, it had remained undisturbed for a very long time. Scientists at Johnson Space Center carefully examined this Martian visitor. Years later, physicists made a remarkable announcement. This meteorite contained tiny structures that looked just like living organisms found on Earth. NASA immediately shared this discovery with the world. We found fossilized evidence of life on Mars. However, as other scientists got their hands on the rock and conducted further studies, they began to doubt it. Yes, it was a fascinating piece of rock, but Martian chemistry might create similar structures without life being involved. So, unfortunately, it wasn't conclusive evidence. But all this debate raised a very important question. Would we recognize extraterrestrial life if we saw it? There are more than 200 different definitions of life in scientific literature. So, what should we be looking for? To figure out what makes something alive, scientists have come up with 3 important things that living things must have. First, living things need to store information about themselves. This information tells them how to work and what they're like. It's a bit like having a set of instructions for how they function. Second, they need to be able to interact with their environment and create reactions. These reactions help them get energy, move around, and respond to changes or dangers. Lastly, they must be able to make copies of themselves, reproducing, and making other things that are just like them. This ability is a big part of what makes something alive. The famous physicist Erwin Schrödinger was one of the first people to figure this out. He said that storing, using, and passing on information is super important for life. It's like a cycle. Information helps create reactions, and some of those reactions let living things make copies of themselves. On Earth, we see this in action. We humans, for example, have DNA to store our information. It helps us with our evolution. Thanks to all this, we can adapt to our surroundings over time. Nature sees that some traits are helpful for survival, so they stick around, while others get left behind. In other words, a way to define life is by saying that it's subject to this process called Darwinian evolution. But how did it happen that things capable of evolution appeared? And when did the very first life emerge in our universe? To find out the answer, let's go to the very beginning of everything. The beginning was the Big Bang. Right after it, there were no stars or galaxies. The universe started as a mostly even and empty place, with just a tiny bit denser than the rest. After the first second or so, first protons, neutrons, and electrons, among other particles, appeared. And just about a couple of minutes later, these protons and neutrons came together to make stable atomic cores. Then, everything was a super-hot soup of particles for about 380,000 years. It was way too hot to form anything dense. The universe needed some time to chill. After it calmed down a bit, it let electrons join these cores, forming neutral atoms for the first time. Finally, some comfy temperatures. If we were there, we wouldn't have needed the sun to keep us warm. That cosmic background radiation would have been enough. Could life appear at this point? Probably not. In those early moments after the Big Bang, The universe had only hydrogen, helium, a tiny bit of lithium, and almost none of the other elements life needs. Life, as we know, requires things like water and organic compounds, so it wasn't about the temperatures, it was about the ingredients. Now, everything had to form over time from these atoms. To create something like a planet, which is much denser than the universe on average, it needed a lot of time and gravitational squeezing. Gravity is the real hero of this story. It changed the universe completely. Even though it started slow, it kept going and got stronger. Regions that were a bit denser could pull in more matter, and the denser they got, the more they attracted. The very first star should have formed around 50 to 100 million years after the Big Bang. These stars could become incredibly massive, hundreds or even 1,000 times bigger than our Sun. And when these stars formed, it didn't take long, maybe 1 or 2 million years, before they disappeared. Just for comparison, our own Sun is 4.6 billion years old and still going strong. When huge stars reach the end of their lives, something incredible happens. They transform helium into carbon, then carbon into oxygen, and oxygen into a bunch of other stuff all the way up the periodic table. Then the star's core collapses, causing a massive supernova. This huge BAM releases all these heavy elements into the universe. Hooray! Now the space is filled with something new. The universe acquires many cool things, including the ingredients needed for rocky planets and organic molecules. Each generation of stars gets even richer than the previous one. Yes to more elements. It means more rocky planets, more essential ingredients for life, and more chances for complex organic molecules to form. And now, when the universe was around 300 to 500 million years old, rocky planets were already popping up everywhere. Great. Can we have some life now? That depends on what we see as life. The recipe for life, as we know it, needs a special ingredient, carbon. Carbon is special because it can bond with other atoms in so many ways. It can connect with different shapes to build all sorts of amazing complex structures. It's carbon that helps us form things like DNA and proteins, which are the building blocks of living things. Now, while the universe made rocky planets relatively quickly, it took a bit longer to get enough carbon floating around. It appeared about 1 to 1.5 billion years after the Big Bang. As soon as it appeared, the universe finally had enough conditions to create life as we know it, which is why scientists are searching for planets around these oldest stars in the universe. These guys definitely had enough time for evolution. But just because you and me are made of carbon and other elements from exploded stars, doesn't mean that all life should be. Scientists are open to the idea of alternative biochemistries. There might be non-carbon-based life that we don't know about yet. For example, blobby beings made of silicon compounds. It's carbon's neighbor in the periodic table. So, when and where did life truly begin? Unfortunately, we don't know for sure yet. Most likely, the universe started preparing for life shortly after the first stars formed. And if all life is carbon-based only, then it should have appeared 1 to 1.5 billion years after the Big Bang. The universe is 13.8 billion years old. Looks like it had plenty of time to evolve lots of microorganisms. So even if we made a mistake, and the mysterious meteorite was just a piece of rock, we shouldn't give up. The search for extraterrestrial life continues, and who knows? Maybe in the future, we'll finally know the answers to all these important questions. Until then, stay tuned.
According to the theory of panspermia, life could have been brought to Earth by a meteorite, comet, or asteroid from a different region of space. At the moment, this idea remains purely theoretical. But let's figure out if it could actually turn out to be true. Traditionally, exobiologists, those who are focused on searching for life outside Earth, have been trying to explore the possibility of life on Mars or in the subsurface oceans of Saturn's and Jupiter's icy moons. But simple life could be much more widespread. It could be drifting through interplanetary space right now, in the form of dormant bacteria and spores. Several scientists have noted that the ultra-harsh environment of space is likely to severely damage the DNA and RNA of such spores and microorganisms. Others believe that since enough microbes could be traveling in a dust cloud, some of them could survive in their original form. There are several types of panspermia. For example, lithopanspermia proposes that some kind of microbic life could exist in debris blasted into the cosmos after planetary collisions with comets and asteroids. Radiopanspermia claims that organisms might be able to travel through space with the help of radiation coming from stars. But in this case, it's unclear how the effect of dangerous ultraviolet and X-ray radiation, combined with the vacuum of space, doesn't totally destroy microorganisms. There's also pseudopanspermia. According to it, organic building blocks of life appear in interstellar clouds of dust. They get transported to the surfaces of planets, and life starts developing there. It sounds really fascinating, but is there any evidence for the panspermia theory? Well, there have been a few orbital experiments. For example, from 2008 to 2016, the samples gathered by EXPOSE, special equipment mounted outside the International Space Station and dedicated to astrobiology, were exposed to the conditions of space. After that, they were returned to Earth from the ISS. It turned out that some of them had survived those severe conditions. There was even a case when 100% of bacterial spores placed in Mars-like conditions were still capable of life. Also, some seeds survived and were later grown as plants on Earth. There have also been exostack experiments on the U.S. Long-Duration Exposure Facility satellite and biopan experiments on Russian photon capsules. They have shown that with minimal protection, spores, lichens, and even minuscule animals, such as tardigrades, might be able to survive in space for as long as several years. A piece of Surveyor 3 lunar lander was brought back to Earth in 1969 by the Apollo 12 mission. Shockingly, it contained an Earth bacterium that had survived unprotected for more than 2 years on the airless surface. At the same time, this bacterium could have come from laboratory contamination on arrival back on Earth. The Indian Space Research Organization carried out a search for space microorganisms too. It was done at stratospheric altitudes via balloon flights. The results showed that living interplanetary cells existed in air samples taken from heights of above 25 miles. Normally, air from lower levels of the atmosphere can't be transported there, so this discovery seemed to prove the theory of panspermia. But in 2010, NASA atmospheric sampling before and after hurricanes proved that under certain circumstances, Earth bacteria could actually be transported very high into the upper levels of the atmosphere. One of the main arguments against panspermia is that if this theory was correct, all life found throughout the solar system would have a common origin and share main biochemical characteristics like genetic code. It doesn't sound plausible. Many specialists believe that only the presence of astronaut explorers on the surfaces of, let's say, Mars, Europa, or Enceladus can properly solve the question of life in the solar system. They can compare any life forms found with Earth-type life, which can turn out to be a real test of panspermia. In any case, until probes finally find direct proof of spaceborne life, the panspermia theory will remain unproven.
It's a clear night, and you're outside looking at the stars. The Milky Way alone seems overwhelmingly huge. You check on your phone and discover that the galaxy you're in at this exact moment is 100,000 light-years wide. For scale, 1 light-year is already a very long distance. For example, it takes 4.2 light-years to go from Earth to Proxima Centauri, which is the closest star to our planet other than the Sun. So, 100,000 light-years is way more than we normal humans can fathom. And that's just one galaxy. There's a whole lot more out there. Now, looking at this data, it seems pretty unlikely that we're the only life form out there, doesn't it? But how come we've never found anything else so far? Let's get one thing out of the way. Extraterrestrial life doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about little green people. It can also mean microorganisms, bacteria, and plants that can be found on other planets. The truth is, there's a big spectrum of possibilities for life on another planet. And taking into consideration that there are up to 50 billion planets in the Milky Way, it's very unlikely that we're alone in this big wide universe. And what does life on other planets look like? This is what we've spent years trying to figure out. Go ahead, think with me. A planet may be lifeless today, but it could have traces of organic matter or fossils, meaning that some life form was able to thrive there once. And it could also be that there are planets out there containing life with complex biochemistry, meaning they could have fauna just like we have on Earth, although probably not the same. NASA created a special science that is dedicated to studying life forms outside of Earth. It's called astrobiology. Ever since the space agency was created back in 1958, it didn't take long for it to start looking for extraterrestrial life. They quickly built an action plan. First, they needed to understand how life on Earth was formed, and secondly, how it could have formed on other planets. The first time NASA tried to look for life in outer space was in 1976. The Viking lander blasted into space, headed towards Mars. There were high expectations that humanity would find the first proof of extraterrestrial life. Unfortunately, the lander came back with images of a planet that looked barren and bleak, and scientists were extremely disappointed. Scientific conclusions on whether life could be detected over there were confusing. But hey, you need to know what you're looking for to find it, right? The failure of the Viking mission served to heat up debates amongst NASA scientists to define what life actually meant. And it also served to call their attention to a small but very important detail. Spacecrafts departing from Earth usually transport Earthling microorganisms and bacteria unintentionally, as they remain attached to the vehicle. It turned out that these bacteria could contaminate scientists' samples, so they needed to consider this. All of this made Mars expeditions take a back burner on NASA's short-term plans. There appeared a new priority-first question: what are the types and stages of life that space programs can hope to identify? Scientists might have encountered life on other planets, but they weren't able to identify it as life. That is why NASA began to study our own planet better. They studied everything from ancient life forms that lived billions of years ago to living creatures that roam the planet today. They understood that the search needed to happen inwards as well as outwards. Let's take a look at the development of Earth's life from its inception. Imagine that this development can be represented as a ladder or stairs, and each developmental stage is a flight of the bigger staircase. First, we would see basic chemistry, a soup of loose chemical elements like the ones we see in the periodic table. But they need to assemble themselves into more complex structures to be able to self-replicate, change, and evolve. This would happen in the second step, where we start to see the formation of microscopic organisms. In the third step, these cells combine to become multicellular beings, allowing for more complexity and variety. The step above sees species that can evolve big brains, enabling the use of tools, culture, and shared knowledge. That's where humanity is located. Looking at this ladder, one might ask, so what does it take for a multicellular organism to evolve into fully formed humans? This is what is called the Great Filter. It's a huge evolutionary jump that takes a lot of effort and the perfect environmental conditions for it to happen. And given that we haven't heard of any other extraterrestrial civilizations out there, it might be that we're the only ones that were able to make this jump. After all, how likely is it that we'll find life outside of Earth that is similar to us? That depends on how many planets there are out there in their star's Goldilocks zone, the area around a star where water can be liquid. And because stars come in all sizes and configurations, this zone is different for every star system. But that's not the only criteria we know for the existence of life. We usually look for three things to detect life: liquid water, methane, and oxygen. Water is what allows for chemical components to mingle and connect, forming multicellular beings. Methane is produced by the decomposition process made by bacteria, and oxygen is the byproduct of plant respiration. These are some of the telltale signs that the James Webb Telescope was programmed to search for. The James Webb Telescope has ambitious purposes that might revolutionize space science. Its top priorities are to detect forms of life by studying small galaxies orbiting the Milky Way. It will also look for the oldest stars in the universe, trying to gather data on the origin of the universe itself. That's huge! NASA is betting on two variables with this new telescope: a thorough scan on the so-called exoplanets, aka planets from outside our solar system, and the search for extremophiles, a type of life that loves extreme environments. Extremophiles were first discovered on planet Earth back in the 1960s at the bottom of the sea near the Galapagos Islands. Scientists found microorganisms living next to hydrothermal vents that dot the sea floor over that part of the world. Thriving in places like these with extreme temperatures over 700 degrees Fahrenheit takes a lot of resistance. I mean, can you imagine the heat? This discovery was a turning point for the field of astrobiology, as scientists understood that life could survive in extremely harsh conditions, similar to the atmosphere available in several exoplanets. But hey, life might turn up in our own neighborhood if we're lucky enough. Guided by the mantra, "Follow the water," NASA is launching two important missions inside our solar system that can contribute largely to the search for extraterrestrial life. You remember Jupiter, right? It's the gas giant that has a moon known as Europa. A few years ago, scientists discovered that Europa had an ocean hidden behind layers of icy crust. And there's even more. According to research, the water over in Europa is salty, much like the water we have on our planet. Europa is a big contender for the detection of life. But the Europa Clipper mission is not aimed at trying to identify this. Rather, it will orbit the moon and gather as much information about its atmospheric conditions as it can. The other moon-bound mission is the Dragonfly, an octocopter that will explore Saturn's moon Titan. The launch is programmed for 2027 and will only arrive in Titan's orbit around 2034. It will sample and examine a series of promising sites around Saturn's icy moon. And who knows, find some new information on ET life? Let's see what happens. But I'd say we've never been closer to a huge discovery than we are now.
Life originated in water, or so we always heard. In reality, it could have begun in ice. We know that it all started more than 3 billion years ago with simple microbes, and it's been evolving ever since. However, there are many theories about how exactly it happened. Maybe not heat, but cold was the beginning of everything. Cells were the first tiny life forms. But before we had fully developed cells, there were simpler things that couldn't survive on their own. Certain important chemicals for life, like the mentioned amino acids, usually float in water in tiny amounts. First, they needed something to help them stay together without spreading all over the place. Otherwise, they would have gotten lost in the sea. And second, they needed to stick together in groups to form more complex things. Moreover, when they started to form in groups, they started the process of evolution. They chose the best molecules to do specific tasks and kicked out the faulty ones. Without this organization, the fastest replicators, or parasites, would have taken over. There were several ways they could organize themselves. 3 billion years ago, oceans were covered in ice. And it turned out that certain important chemicals for life, such as amino acids and nucleic acids, are more stable in colder temperatures. When water freezes, these chemicals that hang out in the oceans get packed together, making it easier for life to form. Or maybe what helped them were special spots called hydrothermal vents. Imagine the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean floor, where hot water shoots out from cracks in the Earth's crust. Life might have started right there, in these extreme conditions. These vents spew out important elements like carbon and hydrogen, which are crucial for life. As the superheated water travels through the Earth's crust, it picks up other important stuff like minerals. When it finally bursts out of the vents, it creates a kind of soup rich in chemicals. In the rocky crevices around these vents, all these molecules could have come together and sparked the first signs of life. The hot, mineral-rich environment acted like a kitchen to cook the first recipes ever for living things. Even today, these vents are home to vibrant ecosystems, showing that life can thrive in extreme conditions. Ancient stories also talk about life starting from clay. It turns out that this idea has a scientific basis too. Imagine tiny particles of clay, like little grains of sand, sticking together in a structured way. As they grow and get bigger, they keep their original shape intact. They form bigger areas and clumps. They become kind of like patches, clay clumps with tiny holes inside. Each patch may be exposed to different things in the environment, like different chemicals or substances. When these outside molecules go through the clay, they get trapped along the way. Once trapped, these molecules get organized in specific patterns within the clay. This process is compared to how our genes organize things. Just like genes tell our bodies how to arrange different parts, the clay patches organize molecules. This theory was created back in the 80s, although it was very controversial at the time. We need more investigation to figure out whether this is true or not. Ancient people could have been onto something when they said that we all started with Zeus's lightning. Life itself is a chemical reaction, and it needs energy. Without energy, nothing happens. Cells are the building blocks of life. You can picture these cells as tiny factories bustling with activity, constantly working to keep you alive. Just like every factory needs a power source to keep its machines running smoothly, they need energy to do their job. In the world of cells, that power source is something called ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. It's an organic molecule. There are also some backup generators with fancy names like thioesters, acyl phosphates, and reduced ferredoxin. They basically work like extra boosts. When life first started, it needed energy to make complex stuff like proteins and DNA. Back then, this energy came from the environment. It could be light, heat, chemicals, or even lightning. That lightning might have kick-started life. Back in the 1950s, scientists did something called the Miller-Urey experiment. They zapped a mix of gases that mimicked Earth's early atmosphere with electric sparks. Suddenly, that caused amino acids and sugars, the basic stuff of life, to pop out. All living things share a special code called DNA, the genetic code. It's one of the oldest and most important things about life. And we think this code existed in the very first forms of life too. This code is quite tricky. It involves putting the right building blocks, amino acids, together in the right order. And there are special molecules called tRNA and mRNA that help with this process. The early version of this code was probably simpler than what we have now. It might have used shorter instructions like using just 2 letters instead of 3. Scientists are still figuring out how DNA first appeared at all. Some think it might have started alongside metabolism, where certain molecules helped put the right building blocks together. Now, they think that the secret to understanding how DNA and proteins are formed lies in looking at RNA. RNA is a versatile player, a molecule that can do some of the jobs of both DNA and proteins. In the past, it could have been the star before DNA and proteins took over. And even though they're the main players now, RNA still has important roles in living things. For example, It can switch genes on and off, controlling how cells behave. But then comes the next question. How did RNA come to be? Well, we need to look for even simpler origins. RNA are big and complicated molecules, but life could have begun with smaller ones bumping into each other and starting chemical reactions. These reactions might have happened inside tiny capsules that acted like cell membranes. Over time, they might have evolved into more complex ones that could do the job better. In other words, life could have started with a basic recipe and slowly added more ingredients. Every living thing is made of carbon. Carbon is an essential life block. It's the stuff that makes molecules, and they form cells, tissues, and organs. Earth was very different many years ago. There were no plants or trees, and the air was different too. Instead of the oxygen we breathe now, there were gases like hydrogen, nitrogen, hydrogen sulfide, and of course, carbon dioxide, which contained carbon. In this ancient world, life might have started in a way where organisms didn't eat other organisms for energy. Perhaps they made their own food from these simple chemicals. They could eat this carbon dioxide, kind of like plants do today, and this is where they receive their carbon from. We call this autotrophic origin. They think that certain metals like iron and nickel, along with minerals containing them, played a big role in this process. These metals and minerals acted like assistants, helping chemical reactions happen that were important for life to begin. They were found all over the Earth back then, especially in places where there wasn't much oxygen. And finally, we have a wild theory that life didn't start on Earth at all. It could have been brought to us from somewhere else. Rocks from Mars sometimes get blasted into space by big cosmic collisions. Some of these rocks have ended up on Earth, carrying tiny microbes with them. So maybe, while we search for life on Mars, it could have been the red planet that started our very own life. Or maybe it wasn't Mars. Others suggest that life might have hitched a ride on comets from other star systems, traveling through space until they landed here. But if life did come from somewhere else, it just raises more questions. For example, how did life start in space in the first place? This is why scientists are a bit skeptical about this idea, which is called panspermia. In any case, the origins of life are a huge mystery, and we'll need decades of research to figure out the full answer.
Your car breaks down in the middle of the highway and won't start. A friendly driver pulls over nearby and gets out some jumper cables connecting your car to his. A few sparks, and your car comes back to life. And that's how life began on Earth. Sort of. There's a theory that life was jump-started on Earth like this billions of years ago. It all started with clouds in the sky. We've all been there, sitting by the window on a rainy day. You wanted to go out and have fun, but the rain pouring outside made you want to stay in bed and snuggle. Still, the lightning and thunder are keeping you awake. With nothing better to do, you think about how lightning even forms. Like I said, clouds, and many other things. You see, when a storm occurs, cold air and warm air meet. The warm air goes up to create thunderstorm clouds, which produce droplets, and the cold air below has ice crystals in it. During a storm, the droplets and crystals have a little mosh pit and move all around. All that bumping and grinding creates electrical charges in the clouds. If you ever replaced batteries on a remote, then you've seen a plus and minus sign on either end of the battery. The plus is where the positive charge is, and the minus is home to the negative one. And just like batteries, clouds have their own plus and minus. The positive charges are kept at the top, and the minus is, you guessed it, at the bottom. So when the charge at the bottom generates enough power, the cloud lets out energy. As the energy travels through the air, it seeks out positively charged objects, like a pole or a tree. And when it finds it, the energy is released and lightning strikes. These bolts of lightning can hit anything on the ground. or travel from cloud to cloud. And thunder occurs because of the hot and rapidly expanding air. So, billions of years ago, the Earth wasn't quite like today. Thunderstorms were a lot more frequent than now, and life was still in its beta phase of things. These lightning bolts may have been the key to kickstart life by producing one of the most important minerals for life, phosphorus. DNA, RNA, and cell membranes wouldn't exist without it. It's essential in all stages of our life, from growth and mobility to reproduction. Everything that makes up who we are is in our DNA, those twirly things with proteins latched onto them. So what do lightning bolts and phosphorus have to do with each other? Does phosphorus flash in the sky whenever a thunderstorm happens? Not really. When lightning strikes the ground, it creates something called fulgurites, or in English, glassy minerals fused in the heat caused by the lightning. And when they appear, they take on the shape of the lightning bolt when it strikes the ground. Some new studies suggest that fulgurites could release phosphorus when dissolved in water. When doing so, phosphorus is able to form biomolecules, which help in forming life. Back then, volcanoes were also pretty big on erupting frequently. So, with ancient hot springs, you'd expect lightning to strike down nearby and produce fulgurites next to those hot sources of water. Scientists were able to estimate that during the early days of Earth, 1 to 5 billion lightning flashes were able to occur. So, in the next billion years or so, we can expect 1 quintillion lightning strikes. Yeah, that's a lot of zeros. With all those flashes and strikes, phosphorus was able to grab its chance to start life when dissolved in water. And of course, not just phosphorus, but a mix of many chemicals and minerals were needed to perfect this recipe. Another theory on how life began on Earth starts all the way in outer space, far away from our little blue planet. Flying through the vastness of space were meteorites. Life on Earth began roughly 4 billion years ago, and these meteorites were busy flying all over the place, with many of them hitting Earth in its earliest shape. Scientists claim these meteorites carried chemicals essential to creating life. Some of those important ingredients were carbon-based compounds, including sugars and amino acids. And they needed wet and dry cycles to bond on a molecular level to finalize the process. So once life was injected into Earth, we got to see the first organisms that were around 3.7 billion years ago. Keep in mind, there wasn't much oxygen floating around or in the water compared to now. But these microscopic organisms, or microbes, left their mark with a certain carbon molecule produced by living things. But life as we know it today wouldn't happen without oxygen, that invisible element that keeps everything alive. So around 2.4 billion years ago, these microbes began changing and became Earth's first photosynthesizers. They made their lunch and dinner using water and the sun rays while releasing oxygen in the process. With many of these new organisms, the rise of oxygen made the environment harsher for microbes, but it was starting to become the baseline for life's groovy track. A new party popped out for those who could dig oxygen. You see, mammals and other organisms have multiple cell types: bone cells, skin cells, muscle cells, you name it. These microbes were single-celled organisms, so with the rise of oxygen, many of these microbes began moving in with other microbes. I don't mean being roommates in a shared apartment. They actually merged with other microbes to become multi-celled organisms. Pretty clever, huh? Fast forward a couple billion years, and we have some of our first animals to ever exist. So actually, around 800 million years ago, the oxygen levels in the ocean and seas still weren't as high as they are today. But one of the earliest creatures on Earth were sponges. Scientists were able to determine this by studying DNA on rock samples dating back to when sponges first appeared. They also claim that sponges sped up the rise of oxygen levels by eating bacteria, removing them in their decomposition phase. Then, around 580 million years ago, more creatures began to appear. The oxygen levels were starting to be acceptable for life to flourish, and many other bizarre-looking creatures inhabited the ocean floor. Even the oldest kind of jellyfish were around. They looked like tiny aliens from another planet. I wouldn't want to find any of those in my drink. and around 40 million years after the end of that period, many of these strange creatures began to disappear. It was then that scientists were able to find evidence of worm-like creatures that were able to burrow in the ocean floor. This is probably one of the first signs of evolution for survival. Then, around 530 million years ago, evolution cranked it up a notch. There were many new creatures out there with new and never-before-seen body parts. Shells and spines and other body parts allowed some of these new animals to further survive and burrow their way around the ocean floor. And shortly after, a couple of million years, the first true primitive vertebrae appeared in something that looks like an eel. This was the creature with the first backbone. Over the next million years, many of these animals began to form skeleton-based and cartilage bodies. And after much splitting, amphibians appeared, and four-legged animals began to walk the Earth's surface. It's also worth noting that there were many mass extinctions that happened along the way. But in the end, life kept evolving. And with many plants and animals emerging, the landscape was changing in the process. Many natural disasters occurred along with ice ages that froze the land and seas. To add to the overall chaos, plenty of volcanic eruptions and earthquakes continued to change the look and landscape of the Earth. The first primates emerged around 4 million years ago, and ever since then, apes and monkeys began to branch out into their own category until humans eventually came into the picture. By understanding these theories, scientists are able to observe other planets with similar conditions. We could actually witness the birth of life on another planet. Of course, this would take billions of years to happen, but I wouldn't want to miss it.
Ah, well-deserved vacay, finally. This time you're off to see something new. It's an ocean on one of the Uranus's moons. All right, just kidding. This destination is not a vacation spot yet. But yeah, there are definitely some impressive oceans out there. Hey, don't say you thought oceans can only be found on Earth. But before diving into Uranus Moon's oceans, let's talk about Uranus itself first. The 7th planet from the Sun and the coolest cat in the solar system. It's got 27 moons, and 4 of them might technically have oceans. That's more than most people have, friends. All these moons are like Uranus's mini-me's. They tilt at the same crazy angle as their parent planet, 98 degrees to be exact. And Uranus is so unique that it orbits the Sun on its side. That means its equator is almost at a right angle to its orbit. Talk about rebellious. But why is Uranus like this? Well, some astronomers reckon it's because it got knocked on its side by a massive collision with another planet. And that impact might have actually created Uranus's moons. Fun fact, those moons have pretty particular names. Instead of mythical figures, most of them are named after Shakespearean characters. I mean, who needs Zeus when you've got Juliet and Desdemona? Discovering these moons isn't easy. They're super dark and located billions of miles away from the Sun. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, except the needle is smaller than your pinky finger. These 27 satellites are divided into 3 groups: 13 inner moons, 5 major moons, and 9 irregular moons. The irregular ones are rebels with retrograde orbits, while the others are prograde and go with the flow of Uranus. The big boys are Miranda, Ariel, Umbriel, Titania, and Oberon, and they're all in Uranus's equatorial plane and are big enough to be round. They've got craters and canyons and cliffs. Oh my. These moons also formed from a giant impact that tilted Uranus on its axis. That's why they're all tilted too. And because of that tilt, they have crazy seasonal cycles just like Uranus itself. But we haven't found all of Uranus's moons yet. The little irregular ones are sneaky and hard to detect, so who knows how many more there could be. But let's talk about the really cool stuff, what these moons are made of. We're not entirely sure, but we think they're made of rock and ice. Miranda is the most icy one, while the inner moons are probably just dusty. And the ones beyond Oberon's orbit, they're likely captured asteroids that could be rocky, or icy, or who knows what. But here's what really sets Uranus's moons apart. They're all tilted together with Uranus. That's wild. Exploring these moons could teach us so much about how ocean worlds form and stay active. Titania is the biggest moon of Uranus, but it's still less than half the size of Earth's moon with a diameter of about 1,000 miles. It's also the 8th heaviest moon in the whole solar system. They named it after the fairy queen in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Titania's color is gray, and it has some shiny patches that scientists think are frost. It's made up of a mix of ice and rock, just like all the other moons close to Uranus. Oberon is the next biggest moon of Uranus, named after the fairy king in Shakespeare's play. It's almost the same size as Titania, and also has a half-ice/half rock composition. But Oberon's surface is way more cratered than the other Uranian moons. Umbriel and Ariel are the third and fourth largest moons of Uranus, with diameters of 726 miles and 718 miles respectively. Umbriel is named after a bad spirit in an old poem, and it's the darkest of all Uranus's big moons. It only reflects 16% of the light that hits it. Scientists don't know why it's so dark, but they think a bright ring around a crater might be caused by frost deposits. Ariel is the brightest of all Uranus's big moons, and it reflects over a third of the light that hits it. It's named after characters in both Pope's poem and Shakespeare's play. Ariel looks like the youngest moon because it only has a few small craters from recent collisions. Miranda is the smallest of all these big moons with a diameter of about 292 miles. NASA says it looks like it's made up of parts from different bodies, like a Frankenstein's monster. Miranda has three big features called coronae that are unique to it. They're lightly cratered with ridges and valleys, and they're separated from older and more heavily cratered parts of Miranda by sharp boundaries. It also has giant canyons that are up to 12 times deeper than the Grand Canyon. Scientists don't know why Miranda has such different features, but one theory is that it got smashed apart by a huge collision and then put back together all wonky. All these big Uranian moons are stuck facing Uranus all the time, just like Earth's moon. Uranus has got some seriously dope features, but the ring system is where it's at. And get this, the ice giant's moons actually have a hand in shaping those rings. Uranus has 13 inner moons and 13 faint rings, and they're all connected like one big cosmic family. Cordelia and Ophelia are like the guardians of the outermost ring, Epsilon. These two shepherd moons keep all the particles together, with Cordelia being the closest to Uranus's surface. But here's the kicker. There are at least 8 other tiny satellites hanging around in that area, making things super crowded. NASA is still scratching their heads trying to figure out how they don't all crash into each other. The inner moons are half ice and half rock, but we don't know much about the outer ones. NASA thinks they might just be asteroids that got caught up in Uranus's gravitational pull. Either way, Uranus and its moon squad are definitely out of this world. Apparently, Uranus's moons might have salty oceans hiding under their frozen surfaces, and the farthest ones from Uranus, Titania, and Oberon could have oceans that are 30 miles deep. That's deeper than the Mariana Trench, 7 miles. But even Ariel and Umbriel might have oceans around 19 miles deep. NASA used some fancy computer modeling and revisited data from their Voyager 2 spacecraft, launched way back in 1977, to figure out the makeup and structure of these moons. They found that Titania is huge enough to keep its internal heat and prevent its ocean from freezing. But get this, the other moons might have a chance at having warm oceans too. The researchers discovered potential sources of heat in the moon's rocky mantles that could release hot liquid and keep the oceans warm. And guess what? The oceans might even be warm enough to theoretically support life. The study also found that chlorides and ammonia are likely abundant in the oceans of these moons. Ammonia acts as antifreeze, and salts in the water could also help maintain the ocean's temperature. Now you might be thinking, how can these icy moons have liquid water? Well, turns out their internal heat and some chemicals could make it happen. For example, a study revealed that chlorides and ammonia are likely abundant in the oceans of these moons. Ammonia acts as an antifreeze, and salts in the water could also help maintain the ocean's temperature. And if these moons really do have oceans, that means there could be other ocean worlds in our solar system and beyond. But don't get too excited. These oceans are pretty salty. About 150 grams of salt for every liter of water. That may not be saltier than Utah's Great Salt Lake, but still. As for Uranus's 5th biggest moon, Miranda, welp, it might have had an ocean at some point, but it probably froze over pretty quickly. Poor little guy. Anyway, NASA is thinking about sending a mission to Uranus to learn more about these icy giants and their moons. They're calling it the Uranus Orbiter and Probe, UOP. Sounds like a party to me. So yeah, technically there might be not 4 but even 5 oceans, but there's still much to learn and explore.
We've been dreaming about life on Mars for a long time. Not only about growing potatoes there in the future, but also about all the potatoes that could have been there in the past. Has there ever been life on Mars? Recently, scientists have found something that could be evidence of that. Let's find out what happened. Mars is the fourth planet from the Sun. A human hasn't set foot on Mars yet, but robots have set their wheels. The first spacecraft that visited the red planet were NASA Viking landers. They flew there back in 1976 and sent us a lot of interesting data. Back then, we didn't know anything about Mars. To us, it looked like a cold, lifeless desert. But since we're so similar, scientists began to wonder, has it always been like this? Or is it possible that once Mars used to be thriving and full of life? And in 2022, NASA's Mars rover Perseverance found something that could shed a light on this mystery. But first of all, what is Perseverance? Scientists have suggested that if there was life on Mars once, it's unlikely that it could simply disappear without a trace. It must have left some traces, perhaps underground, where they would be protected from radioactive solar tantrums and other nastiness. So we need to check the rocks. It's important to note that we aren't looking for life on Mars right now. There most likely isn't any. Instead, we want to look into the distant past of our twin planet. We're talking billions of years ago, when Mars could have been warm, green, and far from lifeless. In other words, we have to find dead microbes and various chemical compounds similar to ones on the Earth. This is the mission of our main character, Perseverance. It arrived on Mars in February of 2021. The spacecraft landed on the bottom of the 30-mile-wide Jezero crater, and after landing, it scooted over to the west, to the place that prompted scientists to choose Jezero for research. This place is a dried-up river delta, and this former river is already more than 3.5 billion years old. The Jezero crater itself was once a large lake. Yup, apparently there was life on Mars, and scientists have suggested that these places would be perfect as bodyguards of microbes. That's exactly what bacteria do on Earth. They hide, being still in the depths of lakes and ponds, so we could probably find traces there. The researchers believe that this particular lake has the highest scientific value in the entire mission. The highest chance to find rocks on which such bacteria could survive is here in Jezero. So Perseverance went to the delta. The row wasn't easy though. The rover missed a little and landed further than planned. As one famous movie said, "This little maneuver's going to cost us 51 years." Fortunately, Perseverance took only 1 year, and on the way, it was able to explore Jezero a little. The rover uses a complex built-in tool to explore the world. The tool is called Scanning Habitable Environments with Raman and Luminescence for Organics and Chemicals, or just SHERLOC. Boy, NASA sure loves its acronyms. As the device approached the delta, the signal of organic molecules became stronger. Soon, these signals were everywhere, and besides, they were the brightest that the scientists have ever seen. What does it mean? Elementary, my dear Watson. You know, Sherlock. It's time to dig. Since July 2021, Perseverance has drilled and collected 4 thin cores of sedimentary rock. The total number of collected rocks at the moment is 12. This is the first time in history that we're collecting something like this on another planet. These 4 cores were found on 2 rocks called Skinner Ridge and Wildcat Ridge. The first pair of cores, the ones from the Skinner Ridge, don't seem very interesting at first glance. They're quite close to what we can find in many places on Earth. However, if we look at them closer, we'll see that they're dotted with round grains of some dark material. These dark grains could have once been deposited on them by an ancient river, the same one that flowed into Jezero. It's possible that the river brought them from places hundreds of miles away from Jezero, and that's pretty cool. If we study these cores, we'll be able to learn even more about the far corners of Mars. Well, there are no corners on it, but you get the idea. Then, in April 2022, Perseverance did arrive at the delta, and then scientists finally found what they were looking for. The discovery, to put it mildly, excited them. They found 2 more cores, which held organic substances. This pair was taken from the Wildcat Ridge. It's found very close to the Skinner Ridge, but the 2 rocks are quite different from each other. These samples are lighter in color and more uniform. Most likely, they're mudstone, an unusual rock similar to clay but harder and unable to absorb water. They're also finer grained than the cores of the Skinner Ridge. Why does it matter? Because the finer the grains in the stone, the more likely it is that there may be some traces of a past life in it. On Earth, fine-grained stones most often lie on the bottoms of ponds and in similar places. There, they can preserve the remains of dead organisms and similar stuff for years. And this is exactly what we found on them. Additionally, according to scientists, there was more organic matter in these 2 cores than in any other place studied by Perseverance so far. It probably accumulated there while the lake was gradually evaporating billions of years ago. So, there really was life on Mars? Well, let's slow down a little. Organic substances are molecules holding carbon. And yes, on Earth, they're most often associated with life, but not always. Sometimes they can form as a result of other things. Therefore, we cannot say for sure whether there was life on Mars. We don't know if these molecules really remain from some Martian microbes, or if they're the result of some other things. But the discovery is still very significant. We have to literally keep digging this way. To learn more about this organic matter, scientists need to collect a couple more samples of fine-grained rock. It would also be great to study the material lying around these former reservoirs. Perseverance has already moved to another area, to a place with a beautiful name, Enchanted Lake. Now it needs to look for similar things there. It will also continue to study Lake Jezero. Eventually, Perseverance will climb to the top of the delta and then continue exploring ancient sites outside the crater. Sometime before the end of 2022, Perseverance will probably have 6 or more samples of the Martian cores. Unfortunately, its tools, though complex, are quite limited. This data alone won't be enough for us to get a complete picture. Therefore, NASA plans to send other spacecraft to Jezero in the coming years. Together with the European Space Agency, they're working on the next robotic mission, known as the Mars Sample Return. The name speaks for itself. These devices will arrive and take away all the test tubes from the old Prospector Perseverance. After that, these samples will be delivered to Earth, though not by Amazon Prime, and then scientists will be able to analyze them in advanced laboratories. However, all this will take a really long time. The launch of this mission is scheduled for 2027-2028, and the spacecrafts won't be able to return until 2033. But if everything goes well, it will be the first samples in history delivered to Earth from Mars. In other words, there's still enough space for research, literally. And yes, we don't yet know the true meaning of these finds. But that's why the entire mission was created, right? And who knows? Maybe in a few years we'll finally find out the truth about what happened on Mars billions of years ago. Ooh, check out The Martian! Made you look.
We fly away from Earth to look at it from a distance. It glows like a holiday tree. Big cities look like yellow spots at night, and during the day we see strange structures, like a palm tree-shaped island in the UAE, or a dark band that runs all the way through China, the Great Wall. These are traces of human existence. Now let's point our telescope at other planets. Mars, it's just an empty, endless desert. Venus, only rocks and volcanoes. Even if we look into distant space, all the planets out there are deserted and lifeless. Not a single trace of an extraterrestrial civilization. Many people are convinced that life on Earth isn't unique at all. Here's our galaxy. There are billions of sun-like stars. And here is the entire observable universe with billions of such galaxies. There's an almost infinite number of stars, and near each of them, there may be habitable worlds. But we may not have found life on other planets because it hides from us under the surface. For example, there's Europa, a satellite of Jupiter, slightly smaller than our moon. Its structure resembles a soft-boiled egg. Its surface is a hard crust of ice, but if you take a big enough drill, you can get to the liquid yolk. an ocean of water. Jupiter and its satellites are very far from the Sun, so it's quite cold there, about 270 degrees below zero. So liquid water instantly turns to ice. But Jupiter has a strong gravitational force that causes a lot of friction inside Europa, and its core heats up. The heat melts the ice, and we have a watery ocean under the surface. Water is the foundation of all life, so there could be simple bacteria in that ocean. And who knows, maybe there are other life forms out there. For example, weirdly shaped fish. Because of the weak gravity, their bodies are built differently, or something like whales feeding on plankton. In 2009, scientists found a planet that is completely covered by an ocean, GJ 1214. It's about 40 light years from Earth, and about 75% of its mass is water. Still, the temperatures on this planet are so high that water evaporates and takes the form of super liquid water. There's so much steam that it feels as thick as water itself. No life could exist in such conditions. But scientists have recently found at least 24 planets better than Earth and called them superhabitable. These planets orbit distant stars in their habitable zone. It's the sweet spot at a perfect distance from the star. In our solar system, Venus, Earth, and Mars are in this zone. A superhabitable planet must be 10% larger than Earth and have stronger gravity. That way, it can have a denser atmosphere. A temperature 8 degrees higher than on Earth would make the planet more humid. This would encourage a variety of living organisms there. These planets may be great for life, but it's hard to tell if there is life there already. The main marker that would confirm the existence of an advanced civilization there might be radio waves. Imagine a habitable planet similar to Earth. In the process of evolution, intelligent beings appeared there, like humans. They're much taller because of low gravity, and their eyes are adapted to the light from another star, much brighter than the Sun. Sooner or later, this civilization will have to use radio waves to communicate with each other. We can think of these waves as loud sound from speakers. Here's Earth. We're now actively using radio waves, and the noise coming from our planet is pretty serious. If a neighboring planet had radio telescopes, big dishes that catch these waves, they would realize that life is blooming here. There are many radio telescopes on Earth that are pointed into distant space, waiting for a signal from aliens. But we haven't received anything yet. Still, that doesn't mean there isn't a planet somewhere in the universe that emits radio waves. It's all about distance. We're jumping 200 light years to another star. Suppose there's a planet X where life exists. The civilization here is advanced enough to use radio waves, so they release the first wave into space. Our radio telescopes won't be able to pick it up until 200 years later. This also works the other way around. Radio communication on Earth has only existed since 1895. Our radio signal won't reach Planet X until 2095, and only then the aliens will hear our voice. But this radio noise doesn't stay for long. Every year, our technology improves, and our radio noise decreases. We're beginning to use mobile communication, cable TV, and fiber optics. This all reduces the volume of our planet in the radio spectrum, and soon we will simply become invisible to other planets. The same thing is happening on the other side. So, the radio waves coming from civilizations are a brief blip on the cosmic scale, and we can't accept radio silence as proof that extraterrestrial life doesn't exist. A giant telescope, which could take a direct photo of a possibly inhabited planet, would change the situation. We zoom in on the photo, and there it is! We see alien cities with tall buildings and lots of antennas. But now, we can't look that far away. We can take pictures of Mars and its satellites, and even their quality misleads us. For example, Cydonia. It looks just like a human face on Mars. We thought there used to be an ancient civilization there that made some sort of sculpture or memorial. More extravagant theories said it was the remains of a giant human, and there's a whole body of it under the sands of Mars. But in fact, it was just a hill. Strong winds blew out some hollows there, and when there was a shadow in those hollows, we took them for human eyes and a mouth. Or a monolith on Mars' satellite Phobos. We found a smooth rock there that was almost as tall as the pyramid of Cheops. The news has spawned many theories about the civilization that built it, but it turned out to be no more than a rock. The infinite number of stars and worlds around them almost guarantees the existence of other civilizations, so why wouldn't they come to Earth, right? We think that life throughout the universe develops in similar scenarios. the emergence of simple life forms, followed by evolution and growth of a technologically advanced civilization. But just like on Earth, cataclysms happen there too, causing mass extinctions. Meteorites, for example. Perhaps there was a civilization out there ready to go into outer space, but a huge meteorite, like the one that wiped the dinosaurs off the Earth's surface, made that civilization disappear, and life on that planet began a new cycle from scratch. In addition, the more advanced the civilization, the greater the risk of its self-destruction. Scientists might conduct experiments in machines like the Large Hadron Collider and accidentally create a black hole there. It would begin to swallow everything around it and grow in size. Soon, all the super-developed cities of this civilization and the entire planet would simply disappear. Another possibility for super-advanced civilizations is to travel through wormholes. Those are tunnels in space-time between universes. Aliens might travel through them and lose interest in going back. But it's also possible that life on Earth is unique. That's because our planet was formed thanks to a number of incredible coincidences. The first is the location of our solar system in the galaxy. In the Milky Way, there are constant fireworks of exploding supernovae. The radiation from these explosions destroys everything around it at great distances. Our solar system is right in the sweet spot of the galactic orbit where we're safe from such explosions. Another factor is the moon. One theory of the formation of the moon says that about 4.5 billion years ago, a meteorite the size of Mars crashed into us. If the impact had been straight, the Earth would have just broken apart. And if that meteorite had only scratched the Earth, the pieces would have just flown away. But the collision occurred precisely so that part of the meteorite remained in Earth's orbit and formed the moon. Then, the moon stabilized the Earth's rotation and heated our core with gravity. Only then, our planet developed a magnetic field, which protects us from the solar wind. Other scientists believe that life outside Earth may be biochemically different. Carbon and water are the basis of our bodies, but carbon could be replaced with silicon or phosphorus, and water could be replaced with ammonia or methane. These atoms could form molecules of different shapes and perhaps assemble into a living organism. Life based on such elements would be unlike anything seen on Earth.